So I've made a couple videos now on how right-wing YouTubers lie about history, so I figured it's time to talk about how one left-wing YouTuber lies about history. Let's talk about Hakim, specifically his video on the German-Soviet Pact before the Second World War. This video has 100,000 views. This is what, why, how, and that's what the video's about. If you like this sort of thing, don't forget to subscribe and support me on Patreon for early previews of future videos. I'll probably make one on the Kaiser Wilhelm soon. For this one, as usual, I've put my citations down below. Okay, so who is this Hakim guy? Well, Hakim is one of the largest communist YouTubers. He's buddies with a couple other communist creators who make the sort of videos that you'd expect. Criticizing American foreign policy, criticizing liberalism, so on, from a communist POV. But you know what, this isn't Content Cop Hakim edition, this is a video specifically on how Hakim misrepresents and downplays the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that was signed between Germany and the Soviet Union on the eve of the Second World War. Hakim's video title denies that any such pact existed, even though he shows photos of it in the video. Okay, so maybe that's just a clickbait title. But besides that, in the actual video, he downplays the pact over and over, insisting the Soviet Union had no choice but to make a deal with the devil. Hakim also downplays, or ignores, what the Soviet Union did after the pact too. For example, he makes repeated references to the Red Army's mistakes in Poland, without mentioning that those mistakes were actually the massacres of innocent civilians and the deportation of a gigantic number of innocent people into camps in Siberia and Central Asia. He just shrugs those off, he ignores them, so we'll talk about that as well. But Hakim also completely forgets to mention how the Soviet Union wasn't just satisfied with splitting Poland with Germany, but invaded a whole bunch of other countries too, all while providing key material aid to the German war machine as it fought Britain and France. They provided food and war materials to Germany during the Second World War. The Soviet Union was a willing and eager friend to the Third Reich. That's a historical fact. They even sought an alliance with Germany in November 1940. This only changed when the Führer invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, shocking Stalin. The Soviet Union's failure to appropriately prepare for the war cost millions upon millions of innocent people their lives. The Soviet government failed both on a moral and strategic level, and it was only through the sacrifice of its people that German troops didn't make a lake out of Moscow. The reason why Hakim downplays, ignores, and denies any wrongdoing on the part of the Soviet Union is because his video serves a larger purpose. His video is actually not about history. It's a political video from a political channel. Now, alright, I'm not a communist, I'm not talking about communism, but I have no problem admitting that my country, the United States, has done and is doing plenty of horrible things. You might love the Soviet Union, you might love communism, but ask yourself, did the Soviet Union ever do anything bad on purpose? Or was it all just a mistake, just a tiny accident? Or if it was on purpose, maybe it was just the fault of a few bad actors. Because that's the exact same justification blind nationalists use to defend their favorite country. It's the same corrupt thought process Zoomer historian uses to defend Germany in World War II as well. It is only by recognizing the mistakes of the past that we can build a better future. It sounds cliched, but it's legitimately true. History is about understanding the world, not twisting it to serve as blind propaganda. Now, right off the bat, I imagine that I'm going to get a lot of reflexive, negative feedback from fans of Hakim or fans of mine who might be of the far left persuasion. You're probably typing up stuff like, "Who cares? The Soviets were the ones who beat Germany after all," or "America was worse," so on. First, just because, this is important, just because person B was worse doesn't mean anything person A did is permissible, that we should just ignore all of it. All of Stalin's atrocities I discussed later in the video did not need to happen in order to beat Germany. In fact, they weakened the Soviet Union, making it harder for them to fight Germany. The victims did not need to suffer. But you know what, that's enough yapping, let's get to the video. Now, Hakim's video starts off by recommending this podcast episode, How Stalin Tried to Prevent World War II with Michael Jabara Carly. After listening to this episode, it's pretty clear that Hakim based his entire video on it. This is especially clear because his other sources don't really seem to build up his central argument, but instead just random tertiary claims. Now, I don't want to get too much into detail about Carly, but it's pretty clear from a quick glance at his tweets and articles about current events that he's fallen off his rocker and blindly supports anything opposed to America, including fascist Russia and its invasion of Ukraine. This sort of biased person is not the right historian to exclusively base your whole video on, because they can very easily introduce their bias into their writings, twisting even archival documents to serve their own personal political preference. Carly does seem to be a great researcher, but if you want an honest view of history, if you want an honest interpretation of that research, you need other historians too. The key is balance. But okay, that's enough yapping again. Let's hear from Hakim himself.
Hello. We hear a lot about a supposed Hitler-Stalin pact, and much noise is made trying to link by extension two wildly differing ideologies and nations together through some forced horseshoe theory nonsense. If you're unaware, the horseshoe theory claims that the far left and the far right, rather than being at opposite and opposing ends of a linear political continuum, are instead incredibly similar. This is the sort of brain-dead take you expect from so-called liberals who consider themselves enlightened when doing their both sides are bad shtick. Historically, the so-called liberal center has always immediately sided with the far right when it came down to it, while the far left was the only one to have any real form of successful and organic resistance, but that's not why I'm here today. Let's discuss the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Okay, so immediately Hakim is setting out a political agenda. He wants to defend the Soviet Union from charges that it collaborated with Germany because it makes his team look bad. He doesn't want his ideology associated with the bad guys. He even shoots off an accusation that the Allies were actually the ones who collaborated with Germany with the Munich Agreement of 1938. Even though, of course, Munich paled in comparison to the deals Stalin later signed with Germany. In order for the Munich Agreement to even be in the same league as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, we'll talk more about that later, France would need to, invade Czechoslovakia alongside Germany, which it didn't, by the way. It's clear that Hakim is stuck in a Cold War siege mentality where he has to defend or shrug off everything the Soviet Union did because it's his political, tribal affiliation. But what if the USSR, and yes, Britain and France, but especially the USSR, what if they just did something bad? Is that so crazy to accept? But let's keep watching.
Let's discuss the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Note, the USSR and the Stalin era specifically was an incredibly nuanced episode of history. There are no great men, history is made by people and material conditions. Actions aren't taken in a vacuum, but instead are affected by real deficits and changes as they occur. Very rarely does something in history happen because someone is crazy, whatever that means. Much more commonly, we're simply missing or refusing to investigate the context. You don't have to like the USSR to be fair to the conditions it found itself in, nor do you need to agree with the actions taken just because you can understand why a certain action was taken. Broaden your mind a little, don't insult your intelligence, and be better than those that lap up the laziest pop history propaganda. Let's get started.
Hakim makes a fair point here, I'll give him that. We'll see this over the next few minutes, but the Soviet Union was not in a position to be especially idealistic in its foreign policy in the late 1930s. But the same goes for the Western Allies too. If I were the Prime Minister of Britain, I would have done a lot of things differently. I'm sure Hakim would have too, but I'm bringing hindsight that Chamberlain didn't have. How about I throw out a little Marx for you to win back some of the communists that are probably angry at me. Men make their own history, Marx writes, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. But we also shouldn't let nuance, or whatever Hakim says, prevent us from understanding real decisions. Stalin wasn't some low-level bureaucrat, he was the power in the Soviet Union. Michael Jabara Carly admits that he killed thousands upon thousands of any people who possibly could oppose him in the Soviet Union. So it's fairly obvious he could have made different choices, just like the leaders of Britain and France could have as well.
A frequent trope we hear is this: the 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a military alliance between the USSR and Nazi Germany. This framing usually follows attempts of paralleling the USSR and Nazi Germany, and by extension socialism and fascism, in an ideological attempt at painting a certain strand of liberalism as apart and somehow more legitimate to the concepts of integrity, quote-unquote being on the right side of history, etc. than socialism. Note that this rarely is used against fascism and is intended solely to paint socialism in a bad light. I wonder why.
Okay, so Hakim is making 2 points here. 1, critics of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact have a political motive, and 2, I don't really know what his second point is. He says kind of like that people don't criticize Germany for signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact because they like fascism. I don't get that. I don't see how that adds up. But let's talk about the first one first. 1, you can't debunk a biased political argument with another biased political argument. But let's get back to his second claim, which is, this is rarely used against fascism. Hakim doesn't say what this is. What exactly is rarely used against fascism? Because he throws out all these random attacks against liberalism in his video, so that could mean 2 things, I think. 1, accusing a country of being on the wrong side of history is never used against fascism, but this is an extraordinarily ridiculous claim. Does Hakim honestly believe that liberals don't criticize the Third Reich for being bad? That's like the entire premise of modern liberalism as an ideology. 2, he must mean this as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But why would anyone criticize Germany for making a deal with the Soviet Union unless you believe that the Soviet Union was worse than Germany? Why would liberals say this? Why would anyone say this? I honestly have no idea what Hakim meant. It's clear to me that he's actually just making a clumsy and nonsensical jab at liberals, because again, this is a political video that's making a political argument, but let's just get into the actual historical part of the video. Okay, so since I know that you all are here for the most important part, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, I'm going to fast forward past Hakim's first 5 minutes of background explanation. I'll definitely respond to his claims afterwards, but for now I'll provide my own summary of the background info. Throughout the 1930s, the Soviet Union sought a solid alliance with Britain and France in order to contain the thrashing of Germany. That's a historical fact. The diplomatic effort to create so-called collective security was spearheaded by Maxim Litvinov, the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs. Michael J. Carley talks a lot about Litvinov, raising him up to practically heroic levels. But the French, and especially the British, were suspicious of the Soviets for various reasons. I'll talk about that later, but they dragged their heels throughout the 1930s, even when Germany began to goose-step across whole countries. This proved to be a very stupid decision on the part of Britain and France. They nearly shed their reluctance in August 1939 after Germany invaded Czechoslovakia and appeared gearing up to invade Poland next. But Britain and France again dragged their heels even as complete disaster loomed over Europe. They just didn't trust the Soviet Union at all. Now, I'm purposely skipping a few key details I'll tell you about in a minute, but let's hear how Hakim describes what happens next.
With the collective security policy not bearing fruit, the USSR decided the next best course of action was some kind of treaty with Germany that would delay the war machine the Soviets knew were coming for them. Soviets understood that the West's appeasement policy that had resulted in the annexation of Austria and Czechoslovakia was a failure and prelude to an expansionist war by Germany, and that Poland was in Germany's crosshairs next. The Soviets sought to buy as much time to prepare and therefore was left with the unenviable position of having to sign a non-aggression treaty with Germany in order to provide for the security of the USSR and her citizens. All this is also forgetting that the USSR was the last country to sign a non-aggression pact, after Poland and France and Belgium, the Baltic countries, amongst others. That's always never mentioned. I wonder why.
Okay, first, nobody complains about the Soviet Union and Germany signing a non-aggression pact in a vacuum. They complain about the Soviet Union signing a non-aggression pact with Germany 2 weeks before the Second World War, giving them the breathing space they needed to invade and butcher Poland. They complain about the secret protocols of the non-aggression pact, which were nothing better than an imperialist agreement to cut up Eastern Europe like a cabbage pie, and they complain about the unnecessary and voluntary aid the Soviet Union provided Germany up until the very end. Since Hakim is unwilling to talk about all the details of how this treaty came about, probably because they make his team look bad, I'll do so now. Remember Maxim Litvinov, the hero of collective security, the head of the foreign ministry, and Michael Carley's favorite statesman of the 1930s? Right, well, Stalin fired him on the evening of May 3rd, 1939, and replaced him with Vyacheslav Molotov, namesake of the Molotov cocktail. We'll talk about how we got that nickname later. But anyways, a clear and obvious reason for Litvinov's sacking was his failure to woo Britain and France into an alliance. But Stalin might also have been giving a public warning to Britain and France to get their acts together. Of course, this didn't work, as we talked about. But another key reason, pretty important, for Stalin firing the guy was Litvinov's ethnic heritage. He was born Meyer Heinrich Wallach Finkelstein. Decades later, Molotov remembered Stalin ordering him to, this is pretty important, Molotov himself says this, Stalin ordered him to purge the Ministry of Jews. This is something he explicitly remembers Stalin telling him to do. And why did Litvinov's heritage matter? Why did Stalin want to purge the Ministry of Jews? Well, Stalin wanted to explore additional options. Per recovered documents, a Soviet diplomat named Pavel Astakov, who was handling a key economic dispute with the Germans at the time, asked his counterpart on May 5th whether this event, he's talking about Litvinov being fired, would cause a change in German attitude toward the Soviet Union. He stressed very much the great importance of the personality of Molotov. On August 22nd, the Führer spoke to his generals and specifically said Litvinov's replacement was decisive. Both sides knew what was happening. Now, Litvinov's canning didn't end collective security. Molotov continued efforts to get an alliance with Britain and France through the summer of 1939. But Stalin was now more open to a possible understanding with Germany, and Germany continued its efforts to woo the Soviets away from Britain and France. Now, historians argue back and forth when exactly the General Secretary opened his mind to rapprochement with the Reich. Geoffrey Roberts argues it took until late July 1939 before Britain and France's attachés arrived in Russia to negotiate. As Soviet-German negotiations began in secret, the outline became pretty clear of what both sides wanted. This wouldn't just be a normal non-aggression pact, but a settlement of a number of territorial political issues in Eastern Europe, as Geoffrey Roberts puts it. Already Germany was proposing splitting the continent in half. As Soviet negotiations with the democracies broke down, the Soviets switched tracks toward the Germans. At first, the Soviets called for Ribbentrop to visit August 26th or so, but with Germany's deadline for starting the war coming, the Germans called for an earlier date. Here's what Roberts writes. In a letter to Hitler, Stalin replied personally, agreeing that Ribbentrop arrive in Moscow on the 23rd of August. Within a few hours of his arrival, they signed a deal. Why was the Soviet Union so interested in a deal with Germany? Well, perhaps the best source we have is the diary of Georgy Dimitrov, the leader of the Communist International, who met with Stalin on September 7th and wrote that Stalin said, "A war is on between two groups of capitalist countries, for the redivision of the world, for the domination of the world. We see nothing wrong in their having a good hard fight and weakening each other. It would be fine if at the hands of Germany, the position of the richest capitalist countries, especially England, were shaken. We can maneuver, pit one side against the other, and to set them fighting with each other as fiercely as possible. The non-aggression pact is to a certain degree helping Germany. Next time we'll urge on the other side." Michael J. Carley, who if you remember is Hakim's real source throughout this whole video, admits this is a real quote from Stalin. Now, of course, he adds that the West was just as cynical. That's fair. We'll talk about their failure later, but you have to admit, this was a pretty revealing thing for Stalin to say on the eve of the Second World War, don't you think? Now, why was Germany so interested in a deal with the Soviet Union? Well, back on the night of August 18th, 1939, the German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop messaged his ambassador in Moscow, Count von Schulenburg, and said, "The Führer considers it necessary that we be not taken by surprise by the outbreak of a German-Polish conflict while we are striving for a clarification of German-Russian relations. He therefore considers a previous clarification necessary, if only to be taken into account Russian interests in case of such a conflict." So clearly the Führer had major worries about invading Poland if Germany hadn't yet signed a deal with the Soviets. Now, I believe there was probably like a 90-95% chance that Germany would have just invaded Poland anyways. But with the pact, there was a 100% chance of Germany invading Poland. The Soviet-German friendship also had a key economic dimension. On August 22nd, the Führer addressed his top generals to discuss the coming war with Poland, and probably Britain and France as well. He specifically said, "We need not be afraid of a blockade. The East will supply us with grain, cattle, coal, lead, and zinc." Which gives us an even deeper explanation as to why Germany saw positive relations with the Soviet Union, to create its own continental system against the British blockade. As history would soon show, that aid that the Soviet Union provided to Germany was very important to its war effort. But let's move on. Next, Hakim cites an interview in Times magazine with a former US ambassador to the USSR who says that the Soviet Union acted rationally to buy itself time. He says that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was not a pact for a mutual offensive against Germany's enemies, in that it provided only that neither would attack the other. They gained precious time, which they feverishly employed to protect their security against the inevitable Nazi attack. Hakim uses this to argue that
by now it should be crystal clear that the narrative that resulted from Cold War distortion is in blatant contravention of the facts. The fact the USSR signed with Germany wasn't a military alliance, it was a means of buying time to prepare for the easily anticipated invasion.
Except one problem. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had a secret protocol. That's what I've been talking about. This interview from the ambassador was given in 1943 in the midst of the war, and the secret protocol was only discovered by the wider world 3 years later in 1946 when it was published in newspapers. Using a source before people knew about the true secret extent of the deal, which negotiators on both sides admitted was key to the agreement, is manipulative. Hakim must know, or if he doesn't know, then he maybe shouldn't have made this video, he must know that this is not an honest source to use. We'll talk more about whether the Soviet Union actually feverishly prepared for war with Germany in a minute, but let's hear what Hakim has to say next.
Related to the military alliance myth is the claim that Stalin conspired with Hitler to partition Poland between Germany and the USSR in one of the secret articles of the pact brought by the Germans, specifically secret article number 2. If you read through it, it's fairly clear as to what Germany's true intentions were. The most obvious happens to be in the first line of the article. In the event of a territorial and political rearrangement of the areas belonging to the Polish state. This is a rather long-winded and euphemistic way to describe an invasion. The phrasing really betrays what the Germans wanted to do and then presents them in the treaty as a pure hypothetical. Also, remember, this is a secret provision of the treaty, which only serves to further make clear that Germany was starting in Poland in what had till then been a series of easy, albeit diplomatically draining annexations via the appeasement by Western powers. After all, while the Germans made it obvious that they were bent on expansion, they still wanted to have the veneer of plausible deniability. They soon use another euphemism for invasion as well, since the existence of an independent Polish state is implied to be in the hands of the signees' respective governments rather than, the Polish people themselves.
This is the most confusing part of the video for me because Hakim is making an argument fundamentally opposed to the whole thesis of his whole video. I honestly don't know if he understands this, so I'll explain it. He says in one sentence, related to the military alliance myth is the claim that Stalin conspired with Hitler to partition Poland between Germany and the USSR. He argues that this is false throughout the whole video, so he thinks it's a myth, that it's untrue. But then his next few sentences prove that they did. He argues that it is completely obvious from the text of the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that Germany was planning on invading Poland, which is obviously true. Germany was planning on doing that for months, if not years, but the reason everyone is angry at the Soviet Union, Hakim, is because the Soviets signed the deal anyways. As you admit, he admits this, they must have seen a German invasion of Poland coming down the pipeline. It seems clear to me that they failed to respond appropriately, maybe even enabling it by basically greenlighting German conquest. Hakim admits this. They did not consider the will or the interests of the Polish people. It was cold, it was calculating. You could even say they split Poland into different parts. Partition, if you will. And what you call an agreement with Germany hidden from everyone else in the world while in the midst of negotiations with Germany's enemies. I'd call that conspiring. How else would you describe this treaty if not Stalin conspiring with Hitler to partition Poland? That's literally just what the text of this treaty reads, as Hakim admits. It's either a myth or German invasion plans were obvious. It can't be both. The only way you can hold these two competing ideas in your head at the same time, not only that, but write a script with these sentences next to each other, speak them into a microphone, edit them, and upload it to your hundreds of thousands of subscribers, is through an extremely impressive gymnastic routine of doublethink. But let's talk more about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, because even though Hakim denies it existed in the title of his video, but just showed it on screen, he obviously doesn't talk about it that much. You can see a copy of the secret protocol here, there's a link down below, but it's everywhere online, you could read it yourself. Let's bring up an English translation. Article 1 of the secret additional protocol between Hitler and Stalin reads, Article 1. In the event of a territorial and political rearrangement of the areas belonging to the Baltic states, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the northern boundary of Lithuania shall represent the boundary of the spheres of influence of Germany and the USSR. In this connection, the interest of Lithuania in the Vilna area is recognized by each party. Wait a second. That's not Poland. So right off the bat, if you actually read the whole document, it's abundantly clear that this treaty was not just about Germany invading Poland, it was about the whole of Eastern Europe. There was no risk of a German invasion of Finland, yet the Soviet Union made sure to snatch that slice of the pie. Let's take a glimpse at Article 3. Article 3. With regard to southeastern Europe, attention is called by the Soviet side to its interest in Bessarabia. The German side declares its complete political disinterestedness in these areas. Put a pin in that for a moment. Just let the question of whether or not the Soviet Union will seize territory from Romania anytime soon, despite Germany saying it had no interest there. I wonder why Hakim doesn't talk about this in his video. Actually, instead of just vaguely suggesting ulterior motives like Hakim does throughout his video, I'll make it clear. He doesn't talk about these parts of the treaty because it makes the Soviet Union, his team as he self-identifies, look bad. And the mission of his video, if you remember, is to make the Soviet Union look good. But let's take a gander at the juiciest protocol of them all. Article 2. In the event of a territorial and political rearrangement of the areas belonging to the Polish state, the spheres of influence of Germany and the USSR shall be bounded approximately by the lines of the river Narev, Vistula, and San. The question of whether the interest of both parties make desirable the maintenance of an independent Polish state and how such a state should be bounded can only be definitely determined in the course of further political developments. In any event, both governments will resolve this question by means of a friendly agreement. So it's pretty clear from this text that the Soviet Union, like Germany, was an imperialist power seeking to maximize its strength. Now obviously every country is motivated by self-interest. That's natural, but people like Hakim enjoy pretending that the Soviet Union was some sort of enlightened despotism, guided by motivations superior to those of dirty capitalist countries. You'll see this in a bit, but he spent the first 6 minutes of his video trashing Britain and France for being unwilling to fight Germany in the mid-1930s, but when the Soviet Union signs a much closer deal with Germany all the way in 1939, when it knows Germany is planning on invading Poland, then when the Soviets themselves start invading sovereign countries that Germany hasn't even touched, then Stalin is just buying time for a war he knew was coming. Here, I'll pose a hypothetical to everyone in case you don't see the difference. Imagine if in August 1939, Germany was gearing up to invade France instead of Poland. Let's pretend that the Soviet Union, distrustful of capitalist powers, drags its heels in signing a defense treaty with Britain and France. So Supreme Leader Oswald Mosley of the United Kingdom throws up his arms, fires his Jewish foreign minister, and signs a treaty of non-aggression with Germany. And in its secret protocols, Germany and Britain agree to divide French territory between them. Then, just a week later, Germany invades France, and 3 weeks after that, Britain invades France too, gobbling up a whole bunch of territory and annexing it into the new British Empire. For some reason, I don't think Hakim would be as charitable to Britain in that case. So what does Hakim say immediately after skimming through the contents of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is the subject of his whole video? Is he maybe going to talk about the Soviet territorial ambitions in other countries like Lithuania, Romania, Finland? Let's see.
They soon use another euphemism for invasion as well, since the existence of an independent Polish state is implied to be in the hands of the signees' respective governments rather than, the Polish people themselves. Poland was unfortunately really affected by anti-Semitic conspiracies in the form of Judeo-Bolshevism, the extremely stupid idea that Jewish people were overrepresented in and thereby controlled the Soviet government.
Why did he throw Poland under the bus immediately? It's like he knows he said something bad about the Soviet Union, so he had to turn around and smack someone else in the face to balance it out. But I'll be charitable and assume that he's not making the argument that Poland, being anti-Semitic, didn't have a right to determine its own form of government, because the Soviet Union, as we've showed, also was anti-Semitic. But let's keep listening.
This anti-communist sentiment was a powerful guiding force in the Polish foreign policy. Obviously shunning the possibility of an alliance with the USSR, Poland sought to force strategic military alliances with Britain and France to guard against a Nazi invasion, and signed a mutual defense pact only months before the invasion would actually occur. In this context, Stalin had to make a difficult decision about how to best allow the USSR to survive the oncoming assault, which would be called Operation Barbarossa, which began in 1941.
First, a few points. 1. Poland did not reject an alliance with the Soviet Union because it was anti-Semitic. Interwar Poland was very anti-Semitic, but it rejected an alliance with the Soviet Union for geopolitical reasons. Poland won its independence from Russia in living memory. It feared once Soviet troops entered the country, they wouldn't leave the country for decades. That's what happened in real life. 2. We'll talk more about whether or not Stalin effectively prepared for the German invasion later. Hint, he didn't. But let's listen to Hakim a bit more.
Additionally, the notion that Stalin was secretly planning a joint offensive with Hitler in order to partition Poland hasn't really been substantiated. If you look at the order of events, the reaction of the Soviet leadership, and the actions of the Red Army, which we're going to talk about in a second, you clearly see that this was not the typical actions of a conquering army. Stalin's focus on an invasion threat from Germany and the time he was trying to buy to thwart one was only in regard to the USSR, not Poland. Of course, he only cares about his own nation. The USSR leadership was absolutely blindsided by the Nazi invasion of Poland. It occurred only 1 week after signing the pact and only 1 day after the Supreme Soviet approved it. These are not the actions of a state anticipating a joint offensive. Just to be clear, the USSR leadership understood Hitler was planning on invading Poland, but not so immediately and so blatantly. Due to them being caught off guard, the Soviet invasion of Poland not only happened days after the Nazi invasion, but was hastily and poorly organized.
Okay, so Hakim talks for a bit about how the Soviet army was not in a war-ready state when it occupied Poland. He takes this as proof that the Soviets were not planning on invading Poland and that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact didn't actually partition Poland. This is a very messy section, it doesn't make much sense, so I'm just going to list out some responses. 1. The Soviet army being disorganized is not proof that the Soviets didn't plan to invade Poland, since again, things are changing every day. Maybe the Soviet army was just disorganized from Stalin shooting all his good generals. It was disorganized when he invaded Finland too, and the Soviets had more time to plan that war. 2. There is a difference between agreeing to partition something and planning to actually conquer territory. Historians argue back and forth when Stalin actually set in stone the plan to conquer Poland, but they probably only gave it the green light a few days after Germany invaded Poland. 3. The USSR invaded Poland on September 17th. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, so it wasn't days, like Hakim says, but weeks. Hakim fans, if you're still around, please take this as proof that I am not being biased against him, because this kind of strengthens his argument, and if I was being biased, I wouldn't even point that out. But anyways, when exactly did the Soviet Union actually decide to start invading countries? Let's look at some actual sources. As historian Jeffrey Roberts explains, immediately after the German invasion of Poland, the Soviet Union charted a neutralist, wait-and-see approach. They didn't immediately invade, that's a fact. On September 3rd, however, the German foreign minister Ribbentrop directed his ambassador Schulenburg in Moscow to say that Germany might have to trespass into the Soviet sphere in Poland to wipe up the army unless the Soviet Union invaded first. He said, "Please discuss this at once with Molotov to see if the Soviet Union does not consider it desirable for Russian forces to move at the proper time against Polish forces in the Russian sphere of interest and, for their part, to occupy this territory." Then, on September 9th, Schulenburg messaged back to Germany to say, "Molotov told me today at 3 p.m. that a Soviet military action would take place within the next few days." So at the very latest, the Soviets set in motion their plan to invade Poland on September 9th. Then, the day afterward, the German records say, Molotov modified his statement of yesterday by saying that the Soviet government was taken completely by surprise by the unexpected rapid German military success. In accordance with our first communication, the Red Army had counted on several weeks, which had now shrunk to a few days. The Soviet military authorities were therefore in a difficult situation since, in view of conditions here, they required possibly 2 to 3 weeks more for their preparations. Over 3 million men were already mobilized. Then Molotov came to the political side of the matter and stated that the Soviet government had intended to take the occasion of the further advance of German troops to declare that Poland was falling apart, and that it was necessary for the Soviet government, in consequence, to come to the aid of the Ukrainians and the White Russians threatened by Germany. This argument was to make the intervention of the Soviet Union plausible to the masses and at the same time avoid giving the Soviet Union the appearance of an aggressor. If you were distracted, it's important to look at this message because it shows that the Soviets used ethnic politics as an excuse for their invasion. It wasn't the actual reason, they were just floating it to win the masses in their sudden geopolitical swap toward allying with fascism. So the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a partition, yes, but the Soviet Union did not immediately expect to have to invade Poland to conquer the territory so soon. Like the rest of the world, Stalin was surprised at how quickly Poland collapsed. When it fell, he hurriedly picked up the pace and invaded Poland on September 17th for cold, calculating reasons. I've been ranting for a bit, so let's hear what Hakim has to say next.
A side note, practically all the areas the Soviets would go on to quote-unquote occupy prior to 1941 either were part of the post-Tsarist political structure or had their own episode of the Bolshevik Revolution, which happened to be defeated either by white armies, for example Finland in the Civil War, or German World War I policy, specifically Brest-Litovsk.
The only reason to bring this up at all is to make the argument that Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania, all countries the Soviets invaded, were not legitimate countries. Remember how he says quote-unquote occupy, as if the Soviet Union did not literally occupy them with soldiers. He uses the word occupy over and over throughout the rest of the video without any hesitation, so I don't know why he's being tricky here. And also, it doesn't matter if Finland was part of the post-Tsarist political structure, whatever that means. Finland did not want to be invaded and occupied by the Soviet Union. That's the important part. I don't have any problem saying the United States invaded and occupied countries, so why does he have such a problem admitting that the Soviet Union did the same? Earlier in his video, he condemns Western efforts to snuff out the communist revolution in Russia. If Russians had a right to determine their own form of government and to not be invaded by foreign countries, why do other countries not have that right as well? While Hakim's true reasoning is clear, it's because there wasn't enough red on their flags.
Okay, so if the USSR didn't conspire with the Nazis to partition Poland amongst themselves, then why did the USSR invade Poland? There's plenty of sources that already focus and almost exclusively mention the many unjustifiable mistakes committed by the Red Army, as with any army, of course. But this overemphasis really only serves as a way for liberals to equate the communists and Nazis, which is an ideological pool with the depth of a puddle.
It's really quite extraordinary how Hakim manages to completely pivot whenever he lets it slip out that the Soviet Union might have done anything bad. Back before, if you remember, he instantly pivoted from admitting the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact did not consider the will of the Polish people to condemning Poland as an anti-Semitic country, despite of course the Soviet Union being anti-Semitic too. Now, even in a sort of basic introductory rhetorical question about why the Soviet Union invaded Poland, he can't even answer his own question before instantly pivoting to attack liberal sources that condemn Soviet atrocities. Except almost by accident, he admits that the Soviets did those atrocities. To try to get above any moral hypocritical issue, he offers the lukewarm concession that those crimes were unjustifiable. I am really tired of this sort of hollow rhetoric. How many millions murdered, thrown in camps, ripped from their homes, tortured, but you know what, I'm getting ahead of myself, because not a word after Hakim admits that these crimes were unjustifiable, he retracts everything and says they were mistakes. Unjustifiable mistakes. Because wait, if they're unjustifiable, that means the Soviets did something bad, so they have to be mistakes. Mistakes that any army, he says, would commit. But that's not enough. He has to always consider the political implications because this is a political video about a political topic from a political channel, so he again pivots and says, but this overemphasis really only serves as a way for liberals to equate the communists and the Nazis. Maybe the Soviet Union equated itself to Germany by committing such horrendous crimes by making an alliance with Hitler. Why doesn't Stalin, a dictator who historian Michael J. Carley admits killed at least hundreds of thousands in that podcast Hakim watched, why doesn't Stalin have any agency, moral responsibility, any responsibility over his own actions and orders? Why is it an unjustifiable mistake when it was purposefully done? Hakim is stuck in this Cold War siege mentality where any criticism of the Soviet Union must be instantly and clumsily downplayed and dismissed as politically motivated. Hakim fans, if you don't get what I'm saying, what if you were watching a YouTube video that said, why did the United States invade Vietnam? Well, there are plenty of sources that already focus and almost exclusively mention the many unjustifiable mistakes committed by the US Army, as with any army, of course. But this overemphasis really only serves as a way for people to equate liberal democracy with the communists. You see what cowardice that is? Do you see how cowardly that is? Why is it so hard for Hakim to just admit that the Soviet Union did something bad on purpose? It's insane. I mean, the answer is clear. It makes his team look bad, so he can't do it. But as a communist, Shouldn't Hakim want to learn from the past sins of communism to improve his own belief system? That seems like an obvious thing to do with this subject. Actually, the Deprogram podcast has a whole episode on all the mistakes of communism, which goes about as well as you'd expect.
About the number one failure, we can say, of former socialism, which is that Stalin did not go far enough. That's the show, guys. Good night. Thank you. I'm Hakim.
or there was one, I hope he might be listening, because he was a great inspiration, a channel called Socialism or Barbarism, and they deleted their channel at one point. And I remember their bio being, "We know that socialists have killed many people. The only thing we know for sure, though, is that it wasn't enough." So yeah.
Let me know if you'd like me to respond to that video in the comments. Anyways, let's keep listening.
Let's take a look into the nuance. The USSR leadership's original justification given for the invasion of Poland was to regain lands lost in the Treaty of Riga, which concluded the 1919 and 1921 Polish-Bolshevik War. Ukraine and Belarus, then a part of the USSR, were invaded by Poland in their attempt to re-establish the borders of the Polish Empire of 1772. In the treaty, the Polish border was established by Britain and the US at 200 miles east of the Curzon Line. However, due to the march of time and the migrations of people that occurred during previous eras, the lands acquired by Poland were no longer ethnically Polish, but were mainly Ukrainian and Belarusian. Therefore, Poland was seen as an occupier or colonial power even in these regions by minority groups.
This summary is half accurate, which you'd expect from the Wikipedia article Hakim flashes as a citation. If you want more information on the Polish-Soviet War, the most accessible book I've found is Norman Davies' White Eagle, Red Star. But let's talk about the mistakes Hakim makes. First, the British and the Americans established the Curzon Line, hence the name, as the provisional border of eastern Poland after the First World War. This line basically matched Poland's modern border. They did not establish Poland's very far eastern border, which Hakim says they did. The Westerners had no part in the Treaty of Riga between the Poles and the Soviets, which ended their war in the 1920s. Second, and while Hakim cast all the negative implications of invasion on the Polish side, which perhaps they deserve for escalating a bloody frontier war into a full-bodied invasion, the communists did plenty of invading themselves, marching deep into Polish territory, close to Warsaw even, before being thrown back. Both sides also perpetrated brutal crimes against civilians. This was a very chaotic and very bloody time in the history of Eastern Europe. Also, Hakim condemns Poland for wanting to re-establish the territorial borders of its old empire when he downplayed the Soviet invasion of Finland and the Baltic states since they were part of the post-Tsarist political structure. This is an inconsistency. Both are bad. Now, did Belarusians and Ukrainians in eastern Poland, who were in fact definitely mistreated by the Polish nationalist government, have the right to self-determination and their own sovereign countries? Yes, of course, 100%. Definitely. How does this impact the morality of the 1939 Soviet invasion of Poland? Not much actually, since we already established the Soviets just used them as an excuse. Also, Poland contained non-Polish regions it won in a war, just like the Soviet Union. If you say Poland deserved to be invaded for this, why not the Soviet Union? Let's get back to Hakim though.
The motivations to invade Poland expressed by the Red Army, however, were quite different. They claimed they were compelled to counter the invasion by Germany and liberate the Polish proletariat and oppressed minorities. Now, of course, this may sound kind of two-faced, but they did genuinely believe this stuff, and the work of Kotkin goes as far as to prove as much. The Red Army used slogans of class emancipation with national liberation, which caused confusion amongst the various minorities who had their own interests and scores to settle with Poland. While the Soviets intended to rescue Belarusians and Ukrainians from mostly Polish class domination, each group found support for their own particular ethnic claims and/or projects, of course.
Here, Hakim uses the personal motivations of soldiers and propaganda produced by the army as evidence for Stalin's motivations. Hakim wouldn't hold any other country to the same trustful standard. Does he believe that the United States invaded Iraq to beat terrorism and spread democracy like the government said and the soldiers believed? No. Did the Soviets and Germans glare at each other icily when they met each other in Poland? Nope. In the city of Brest, they held a joint military parade celebrating their conquest, the swastika and the sickle side by side. Not only that, but the Soviet and German invasions coordinated with each other in the first place, sharing information about Polish troop positions. Historian Roger Morehouse says Soviet authorities agreed to allow signals to be broadcast from Minsk to aid in Luftwaffe navigation. That's the German Air Force. This sounds a good portion of the way to a military alliance, if you ask me. Moving on.
Red Army soldiers entering Poland, tasked with preparing local populations ideologically for the invasions, shouted slogans which explicitly encouraged the population to, and I quote, rectify the wrongs it had suffered during 20 years of Polish rule, and disseminated very base leaflets, actually, that urged Polish soldiers to turn their weapons against the capitalists, the landowners, and the military officials, which similarly encouraged the local population to assault their landlords with, quote, whatever was at hand, scythes, axes, and pitchforks. Anyways, as a result of this propaganda effort, much of the initial brutality that occurred in what would become Soviet-occupied Poland, or reconstituted Ukraine and Belarus, the maps get fuzzy after a while, began prior to the beginning of the invasion proper. It should also be noted that most of it was selective, targeting only those of the then perceived as oppressor classes, such as landlords. This is important to mention given that so much attention is given to later mistakes, and this period gets unfairly lumped in by liberals, since they see mega landlords getting a comeuppance and their land expropriated as a bad thing. I don't, clearly.
Now, it goes without saying that the German occupation of Poland was significantly worse than the Soviet occupation. In my Zoomer Historian video, I talk about what happened in German-occupied areas, which during 1941 became the whole of Poland, of course. There's also a whole book on this called Poland's Holocaust, which should make it very clear what happened. Mass murder, deportations, very horrible stuff. Every rational person would see that the Soviet occupation, brutal as it was ultimately better than the German occupation. That's a hard truth, but it's true. But this is a video about the Soviet Union. Even though there were fewer Soviet than German atrocities, that does not mean they didn't happen, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't know about them, or we should ignore them, or shrug them off. Eastern Poland was not a socialist paradise. You can read more about this in the first few chapters of The Devil's Alliance by Roger Morehouse. Anyways, most Polish soldiers stuck in a gigantic pincher assault from both sides just surrendered to the Soviets, but there were about 40 total clashes. When the Red Army seized officers from the Polish army, they quickly just began to execute them. Mirroring Germany's policies in Western Poland, the Soviet Union cracked down violently on the population. The Soviet secret police, the NKVD, began a reign of terror in Poland, arresting random civilians for harmless offenses. And in March 1940, the Soviet Union murdered about 15,000 Polish prisoners of war, chiefly officers, and on top of that, several thousand police, landowners, priests, and intellectuals, dumping their bodies in mass graves in the Katyn Woods. Those are the mistakes that Hakim mentions in passing but doesn't go into detail about. Meanwhile, the Soviets also began a series of mass deportations of other civilians who might prove to be disloyal to the Soviet occupation. These included teachers, priests, intellectuals, and the families of the men killed in the Katyn Woods. Over several months, Soviet forces arrested at least 1 million people in the night, then stuck them on crowded cattle cars, only feeding them rarely on their multi-week journey eastward far from Poland. Huge numbers, about a third, died on the journey, disproportionately the elderly and the young, including infants. The Soviet Union abducted and stuffed infants into cattle cars and let them starve to death. There are first-hand accounts of this, as well as documentation. No serious person disputes this happened. These are the mistakes that Hakim keeps referencing. Mass murder of prisoners and civilians, including infants. Now, this actually wasn't very unusual for the Soviet Union at the time at all. You can read all about Stalin's policies of ethnic cleansing in articles like this one. The Poles weren't alone. Other ethnic groups across this vast Soviet Union also fell victim to a gigantic policy of brutal relocations. Oh, and when survivors arrived in Siberia or Central Asia, their lives were hardly ideal. Starvation and disease wiped out many people. Now, the United States did do something similar during the Second World War. It interned more than 100,000 Japanese Americans in one of the darkest moments of American history. But the Soviet Union's crimes were on an order of magnitude larger. Imagine if President Roosevelt invaded northern Mexico, then deported 1 million Mexican civilians to Alaska, only feeding them occasionally. That's the sort of insane brutality that Stalin and the Soviet government perpetrated in this period. I'm not even mentioning the hundreds of thousands Stalin and his agents murdered in a paranoid, blood-hungry frenzy in the late 1930s for imagined political offenses. Michael J. Carley, Hakim's primary source for this, admits this happened. There's a reason if you look at a list of old Bolshevik revolutionaries, so many died in 1937. Now, surely, Stalin was just preparing the Soviet Union for the Second World War by doing half of Germany's work for them? Earlier, Hakim wondered how liberals would dare compare communism to fascism. Well, if you ignore and downplay millions murdered by Stalin's regime, what else are people supposed to make of your ideology? Does Hakim ever mention any of this? No. He spends over a minute talking about how the Red Army was greeted as liberators by the people of Poland, even though he admits the Soviet Union prepared a large percentage of the spontaneous displays of communism beforehand. Now, to be fair, I'm going to be fair. Ethnic minorities in Poland, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Jewish people, did generally view the arrival of the Soviet Union as better than rule from nationalist Poland. But this in no way justifies other Soviet atrocities. You gotta mention that in your video about this. It's kinda crazy. Remember all the violence and brutality I've talked about? Here's what Hakim says about this.
Soviet invasion plans emphasized the importance of a proper and cordial reception because they saw it as a precursor for a plebiscite that would bring forth the political will of the local populace. With all the celebration, much of the older generation was still terrified, though. Some even went into hiding from the Red Army or worse. However, since the Red Army's approach, characterized by restraint and selective action rather than indiscriminate violence, they managed to garner a measure of relief among the general population, specifically against the groups that were usually targeted, which include officers, policemen, landowners, etc. What's more is that Red Army soldiers, despite commands to the contrary, usually did engage with locals and establish some sort of cordial relationships. After the Red Army established control over the areas they occupied, they embarked on local governance, of course to maintain order, but also to help channel it towards the provisioning of the Red Army, arresting reactionary societal figures, preparing the elections that were upcoming. For the next 20 months, the region that the Soviets occupied experienced a heavy dose of electoral politics. There were 3 different elections, 2 of which were within the first 6 months of the occupation. The United States didn't bother to do that with half the places they occupy, and their explicit goal is apparently democracy. Anyways, I have relevant reading recommendations that you can check out here if you're interested in how the USSR worked and all that. Anyone who has a proper understanding of how the Soviet system worked isn't surprised by how the Soviets operated during the occupation as it relates to civil engagement and participation.
Yeah, this is no better than outright atrocity denial. To pretend that the Soviet Union was just arresting reactionary societal figures when it arrested, tortured, murdered, or starved to death a huge sum of people whose crime, if there was any, and there often wasn't, was just disapproving of an invasion of their own country, is disgusting. You can make the argument that it was strategically necessary for the Soviet Union to occupy eastern Poland before the Germans did. Churchill made that argument. That could make sense, but all the rest of this violence, the atrocities, were not necessary. These weakened the Soviet Union, as I'll talk about in a bit. Also, those elections Hakim mentions, they were not real elections. They didn't have real elections in the Soviet Union, which was a single-party state. Anyways, let's see how Hakim ends this video, then we'll talk about what Hakim conveniently skips, then we'll talk about how this whole mess began in the first place.
Now, it should be clear as to why Western sources demonized the USSR and tried to put the Red Army and its conduct on par with the Nazis. The USSR stayed mostly true to their principles during the occupation of Poland. It should also be clear just how nonsensical the claim about the Soviets and Nazis conspiring to partition Poland is. Rather, the Soviet occupation of Poland could be seen as the Soviets' attempts to save as much of the Polish population from the violence of the Wehrmacht.
Alright, I'm tired of this. I'm just going to throw up some bullet points. 1. No, it's not demonization to call out the Soviet Union for committing mass murder and atrocities. If you think that's demonization, too bad. Don't murder people. Easy. If you think that the deportation of ethnic groups from their homelands, providing them scraps, if anything at all, if you think torturing and mass murder of priests, teachers, intellectuals, prisoners of war, and their families are true to the USSR's principles, then it seems to me that the Soviet Union was pretty bad. He again denies the basic fundamental reality of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, even though he showed it on screen. No, the Soviet Union did not want to save the Polish population from Germany, it wanted to strengthen its own position. Nowhere in the video did he provide any evidence or argument for this, then at the end he just randomly creates the best possible idea for invading a country out of thin air. He has no sources, it's just vibes, and the vibes are looking pretty atrocious to me. I'll give him one last chance to turn this whole video around, but for some reason I don't think he's gonna redeem himself.
Unsurprisingly, there are several reasons, and not all of which were altruistic. Despite that, the Red Army and the Soviets were generally preferred to that of the Wehrmacht and the Nazis, except for a select segment of anti-Semitic Polish people and Ukrainians of Poland who preferred the Nazis because Judeo-Bolsheviks and all that. Regardless, they were greeted warmly by the population, and even though not all were locally organized by enthusiastic supporters, the conduct of the local populace seems to indicate that most people saw them at a minimum as the lesser of two evils. Doesn't make everything they did right, but historical nuance is a interesting and fun thing to discuss. I look forward to random 14-year-olds complaining in the comments because I didn't say Stalin ate Polish babies. And a final addendum, this one will just be a bit rambly. For the love of God, please don't misunderstand me. The Soviets made many mistakes in this. It would have been better that there be no pact. It would be better for them to have not occupied Poland, but if you were in the particular place and the particular industrialization level facing the same kind of danger, I don't know if you would have made better decisions particularly, especially when there was goodwill shown in the form of collective security with France and Britain, which would have prevented all this nonsense to begin with, or at least greatly affected it. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon, it really does help.
What a limp, cowardly way to close your video. It's seriously nauseating how he talks about this subject. Historical nuance is an interesting and fun thing to discuss, except he doesn't discuss it. He makes cloaked references to mistakes without having the guts to actually say what those mistakes were because they make his team look bad. Next he says, I look forward to random 14-year-olds complaining in the comments because I didn't say Stalin ate Polish babies. That's what he says. He's trying to be funny? Is it a joke? Who do you think were the first to die from starvation after Soviet troops tore innocent civilians from their homes, stuck them on cattle cars, and shipped them hundreds of kilometers with barely any food or water? Hakim, the Soviets butchered people. If it weren't for his buddy to the west and his other buddy to the east, Stalin would have been the world's foremost serial killer. But Hakim insists, for the love of God, please don't misunderstand me, the Soviets made many mistakes. Mention one. Say a specific mistake. Say any mistake at all. Why doesn't he say any specific mistake? I suppose it makes bad propaganda, that's the answer, right? Then he says, it would have been better that there be no pact. It would be better for them to have not occupied Poland. Really? Now at the end of 18 minutes of arguing that the pact was okay and their occupation was actually very based and cool, now he says we can't hold him to his own position, that he thinks it was actually bad? Why doesn't he stick to his guns? If it was bad, why do you think it was bad? You can't argue in favor of something for 18 minutes then say at the end, just kidding, don't criticize me, I actually don't support it. Just conclude by saying the pact was a necessary evil, or a necessary good even, because they brought communism, right? You can make that argument. He did for 18 minutes actually, we watched the whole video. If the pact wasn't good, then why did you make a video at all? Why waste our time? Stick to your guns. He also closes the video by making one last snipe at Britain and France, blaming them for this whole thing. We can talk about that in a minute, but let's talk about all the juicy bits that Hakim is too scared to talk about. Because Hakim conveniently forgets to mention anything that happened after the heroic communist parades welcoming the Soviet Union, which he literally admits were organized by the Soviet Army. Now, we've already talked about the atrocities that the Soviet Union perpetrated and mentioned how they coordinated with Germany in their joint occupation of Poland. But let's talk a bit more about what happened to all those other countries the Soviets called dibs on. Well, you can look at Stalin's Wars by Jeffrey Roberts for more information, but soon after it invaded Poland, the Soviets began to bully the Baltic states and Finland. When Finland refused to give in to Stalin's demands, the Soviets engineered a false flag attack that invaded on November 30th. Despite being outnumbered by a huge degree by the Soviet Union, the Finns put up a strong fight. Remember how I mentioned the Molotov cocktail? Well, when asked about the Soviet bombing of Finnish cities, Molotov insisted they were actually dropping food. So Finnish soldiers nicknamed their improvised explosives Molotov cocktails to wash down Molotov's bread baskets. While Britain and France never declared war on the Soviet Union for invading Poland, they did provide help to the Finns. Many Scandinavians also volunteered to fight to protect Finland. In fact, the Red Army's inability to conquer tiny Finland showed the Germans that they were not as tough as they thought they were. Despite putting up a fearsome fight, Finland was forced back and ultimately surrendered its border regions in the March 1940 treaty that ended the so-called Winter War. After Finland, the Soviet Union licked its wounds, then invaded Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, as well as the Romanian region of Bessarabia, modern-day Moldova. Actually, they also seized the area of Bukovina, which angered Germany. As with Poland, the Soviets cracked down on any group or individual who could possibly provide a challenge to their rule. Alongside the usual skeptics, victims of the Soviet reign of terror included Trotskyists, rightists, socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks, social democrats, anarchists, and the like, former workers of the Red Cross, religionists, sectants, and active members of religious communities, per an NKVD document. Tens of thousands were deported like Polish victims to Central Asia, with plenty dying on the route. Hakim does not mention any of this, even though the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact laid the foundation for all this horror. Well, surely the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was the last bit of collaboration between Germany and the Soviet Union, right? Once Stalin shored up his borders, he was done. Let's rewind a little bit. The Germans and the Soviets also signed an economic agreement in Berlin. The Soviets gave raw materials for German finished goods. As the Führer himself described on his August 22, 1939 speech, he saw the East as a source for resources so he could ignore any British blockade and continue fighting his war. Then there was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and of course the German invasion of Poland, the beginning of the Second World War, then afterward the Soviet invasion of Poland. But in early 1940, the Soviets and the Germans again entered negotiations to tighten their economic bonds. When negotiations hit a rut, Stalin intervened personally. So in early 1940, the Soviets agreed to supply 650 million Reichsmarks of raw materials in return for Germany supplying the same value of military and industrial hardware. This is during the Second World War. So the Soviets initially gave the Third Reich 1 million tons of feed grains, 900,000 tons of petroleum, 800,000 tons of scrap and pig iron, 500,000 tons of phosphates, and 500,000 tons of iron ore. This trade kept growing, with the Soviet exports to Germany estimated at 404 million Reichsmarks in 1940. Now, to be fair, the Soviets did get machines of war in exchange, but its trade with Germany was a necessary source of help, especially with the British Navy blockading overseas imports to Germany. Much more important than the rest was food, of course. As Morehouse writes, Germany was effectively reliant on food supplies from the Soviet Union. From the beginning to the end of this agreement, the Soviets gave the Germans 1.5 million tons of grain and 2 million tons of petroleum products. And remember, the Germans were at war with Britain and France during this. Stalin knew this. It wasn't an accident. It was a purposeful, strategic decision he actively made to strengthen Germany in the Second World War. As the historian Roger Morehouse describes, the Nazis and the Soviets traded secrets, blueprints, technology, and raw materials, each oiling the wheels of the other's war machine. But the Soviets didn't just strengthen Germany, they also tried to weaken Britain and France. In a speech to the Supreme Soviet on October 31, 1939, Molotov said, "Germany is in the position of a state which is striving for the earliest termination of war and for peace, while Britain and France, which but yesterday were declaiming against aggression, are in favor of continuing the war and are opposed to the conclusion of peace. Britain and France are seeking new excuses for continuing the war with Germany. The ruling circles of Britain and France have been lately attempting to depict themselves as champions of the democratic rights of nations against Hitlerism, and the British government has announced that its aim in the war with Germany is nothing more nor less than the destruction of Hitlerism. It amounts to this, that the British, and with them the French, supporters of the war, have declared something in the nature of an ideological war on Germany, reminiscent of the religious wars of olden times. In fact, religious wars against heretics and religious dissenters were once the fashion. As we know, they led to dire results for the masses, to economic ruin, and the cultural deterioration of nations. These wars could have no other outcome, but they were the wars of the Middle Ages. Is it back to the Middle Ages, to the days of religious wars, superstition, and cultural deterioration that the ruling classes of Britain and France want to drag us? The rest of the speech is more of the same. Molotov and the Soviet Union were throwing Britain and France under the bus for fighting the Second World War against Nazi Germany. But it wasn't just speeches. While some communist organizations in the West at first supported the war against Germany, they soon got messages from the Soviet Union, the mothership. The British Communist Party was told, for example, that Britain's war against Germany was an imperialist and unjust war for which the bourgeoisie of all belligerent states bear equal responsibility. In no country can the working class or the communist parties support the war. This was a message from the Soviet Union to the British Communist Party. They were trying to weaken Britain and France in the Second World War. While plenty of figures in the Communist Party dutifully endorsed the Soviet Union's new party line, other members were enraged or saddened and resigned. It wasn't just the British Communist Party, of course, but communist parties across the planet who took this new anti-war stance with direction from Moscow. In America, the Communist Party marched in support of peace and called for the United States to stay out of the war. Identical events happened in France, until, of course, it was invaded by Germany. So the Soviet Union was far from neutral. It was an ally of Germany in all but name. But soon talks began to make that formal. In November 1940, Molotov flew to Berlin to discuss frictions in the German-Soviet relationship. The two great powers had begun to frustrate each other, especially with the USSR's expansion into extra territory in Romania and Germany sending some troops to Finland. At those meetings, Ribbentrop suggested to Molotov that the Soviet Union, Germany, Italy, and Japan all clearly define their spheres of influence across the globe. He proposed that the Soviets focus on expanding southward toward the Indian Ocean, a challenge to British India. After Ribbentrop, Molotov met with the Führer himself. While the Führer talked in broad ideas, Molotov wanted to know the specifics of the proposal before committing himself to anything. He also wanted German troops out of Finland, so the talks ended early. The second day, the two sides met again, with a similar course of events happening. In a bunker hiding from a British air raid after the main meeting, Ribbentrop proposed a draft agreement to Molotov, with the four powers agreeing to help each other out. Not a complete defense pact, but something close to an outright alliance, with the Soviet Union focusing its power southward to seize British India, as I talked about. Molotov, of course, didn't sign it right away, and no further meetings resulted. So that's it, right? No more negotiations. The Soviets weren't really trying to seek a German alliance, right? Nope. On November 26, 1940, Molotov delivered the Soviet response to Ribbentrop's draft agreement of an alliance. He wrote that the Soviet government was prepared to accept Germany's proposal of political and economic collaboration in exchange for 1. German troops leaving Finland, 2. The Soviets being allowed to establish a base near Istanbul, 3. An area south of Azerbaijan is recognized within the Soviet sphere, and 4. Japan renounces her claim to coal and oil in northern Sakhalin. Additionally, the Soviets wanted to work together with all these other fascist powers together to wrestle Turkey to give the Red Army access and for Bulgaria to be handed over to the Soviet sphere of interest. This was too much for Germany, which didn't want to hand the Balkans over to the Soviets. So Germany began to switch tracks. Already in July, it had been preparing for a possible invasion. With later negotiations of the Balkans breaking down, the Führer decided to commit Germany to war in December 1940. So the Soviets wanted a deal with Germany, and Germany turned them down. That is the historical fact of the matter. Hakim, by the way, who's the subject of this video, of course does not talk about this at all whatsoever. While Germany built up its army along the Soviet border over the course of 1940, which Stalin received frequent reports on, the Soviet Union failed to prepare appropriately for war. Morehouse writes, essentially Stalin shared Molotov's outlook demonstrated in Berlin the previous autumn that the Soviet Union was in a position of strength in its relationship with Nazi Germany, and that while engaged in the West against the British, Hitler would have to be mad to attack the USSR. Now, there were some preparations from the Soviet Union, this is a fact, but not enough and not as much as the Soviet Union could have done. The Soviet government also failed to complete construction of fortifications in the West that could have slowed down or even stopped a possible German invasion. Why? Why did Stalin do this? Well, Stalin wanted to show restraint, fearing that mobilizing the Red Army would only provoke Germany into attacking. This is the exact same motivation that Hakim condemns Britain and France for having in the 1930s, yet Stalin had their failure to learn from, and he didn't do it. Instead, Stalin went the economic route. Morehouse describes, his approach was essentially to use the economic relationship to appease Germany as far as possible in the belief that Hitler's saber-rattling was purely a tactical ruse. So instead, the Soviet Union shipped Germany another 500,000 tons of grain. Despite what some argue, like in the book Icebreaker, there is no actual evidence that the Soviet Union was actually preparing for an aggressive war against Germany. It did draft up plans, which Roberts describes in detail in Stalin's War, but America had a plan to invade Canada. Stalin mobilized too few troops to defend the Soviet Union, let alone invade Germany. Anyways, on June 16th, with the invasion looming, Stalin was again provided direct information that Germany was planning on invading. He viciously denied the information. When Generals Zhukov and Timoshenko asked Stalin to bring the army into full readiness for war, Stalin threatened them and marched out of the room. On June 21st, a man named Alfred Liskow defected from the German army and warned the Soviets that war was coming. Stalin ordered him to be shot. 3 hours afterward, Ambassador Schulenburg mournfully informed Molotov that Germany was beginning its war against the Soviet Union. On June 22nd, Germany began Operation Barbarossa. Its gigantic invasion force assaulted the Soviet Union, beginning the bloodiest portion of the Second World War. With the Red Army criminally underprepared, Germany washed eastwards. Predictably, many people in Eastern Europe, ruled with terror by Moscow, thought the Germans were liberators. Obviously they were not, but the German army was strengthened by locals who wanted revenge against the Soviets. As the German army advanced, Stalin pinned the blame for defeats on his commanders, having hundreds executed. As the Soviets retreated, the NKVD massacred thousands upon thousands of its prisoners. These all weakened the Soviet Union's ability to fight against Germany. These were not necessary and not smart. They were complete failures. The Soviet government failed to protect its people. Now, of course, I talk much more about the mass murder Germany perpetrated on the people of this area in my video on Zoomer Historian. Everybody knows about this. This is a video about Stalin and the Soviet Union, so I'm not going to go into detail, but obviously Germany was worse. Okay, so we've covered all the ground from August 1939 to June 1941. The Soviets went from pursuing an alliance with Britain and France to cutting a deal with Germany to getting invaded from Germany. But what happened before that? Imagine this like a detective book. We just learned about the crime, now whose fault is it? Now, it's going to be a bit difficult, but I want you to take all the information I just told you and tuck it away in the corner of your brain for later use, because the leaders of Britain, France, and the Soviet Union didn't know with certainty what was coming down the pipeline in the mid-1930s. Let's listen to Hakim again, because remember, this video is ostensibly about him. This is at the minute mark of 150, so remember, we've just rewinded back to the beginning of his video.
Let's give some general background information. Soviet Russia and the subsequent USSR, having only fairly recently won a short but brutal civil war with Tsarist forces and invasions by many foreign powers, oriented foreign policy towards Germany in the mid-1920s. Two lesser-known treaties, the Treaty of Locarno and the Treaty of Special Relations with Berlin, helped shape that Soviet foreign policy. The Treaty of Locarno, between the main European belligerents of World War I, sought to establish a lasting peace, which Soviet Russia would generally benefit from, since the country was so utterly devastated by the Great War and the Civil War following the October Revolution. However, the USSR viewed the treaty with suspicion, since it appeared that Germany was joining an anti-Soviet bloc. The other treaty, that of special relations with Berlin, was meant to assuage these fears by being a 5-year treaty with Weimar Germany, in which they would be neutral in the event that either country was attacked by a third party. Unfortunately, the optimism for long-term peace wouldn't last long. In the late 1920s, the Nazis began their rise to power, which infamously culminated in the appointment of Hitler as the Chancellor of Germany in 1933. The rise of the Nazis caused the USSR to refocus its foreign policy efforts to combat this threat. The policy, which came to be known as collective security, attempted to strengthen relationships with France and Britain in an attempt to isolate Germany. Meanwhile, the fear of Western leaders' imaginations and the interests they served led them to irrationally fear the spread of communism and were reluctant to enter into diplomatic relations with the USSR lest they catch the communist virus.
This is a mostly accurate summary of what happened, but of course Hakim and Carly portray it all from the point of view of the Soviet Union. The USSR's motivations are rational and sensible, while Britain and France irrationally feared the spread of communism and only didn't want to catch the communist virus. So why didn't Britain and France agree to an alliance with the Soviet Union in the mid-1930s? Now, first of all, we have to make it clear that the Soviet Union, unlike Britain and France, actually wanted an alliance more than them before the Second World War. This alliance was the brainchild of the Soviet Foreign Minister Maxim Litvinov. While there's some disagreement among historians, some of whom argue the Soviet Union wasn't actually serious about this, it seems pretty clear to me that the Soviets wanted allies, so it wouldn't be stuck fighting a two-front war against Germany and Japan alone. That's sensible, that's rational, I agree with that. But there were limitations to the USSR's quest for collective security in the mid-1930s. Michael J. Carly, who if you remember is Hakim's chief source and a pro-Soviet historian, highlights the fact that the Soviet Union put it in writing in the 1935 Franco-Soviet agreement that the USSR would only help Czechoslovakia if France did it first. When Germany was gearing up to invade Czechoslovakia in 1938, it was well aware of Soviet reluctance. Count von Schulenburg, the German ambassador to the USSR, messaged back to the German Foreign Ministry and said, Soviet Russia's participation in the war will be of greatest and decisive import. But, he added, the Soviet Union will only intervene in a war if she herself is attacked, or if it became manifest that the outcome will be favorable to the side hostile to Germany. It is therefore generally accepted that, in the event of a German-Czechoslovak war, the Soviet Union will at first limit her assistance to a minimum, for which the absence of a common frontier between the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia could at any time be put forward on the Soviet side as a convenient excuse. Now, from this it's obvious that both sides, the West and the East, were reluctant to stick their neck out, scared the other would ditch them to the wolves. But whatever, Britain and France, wary of the Soviet Union for whatever reason, dragged their heels into the USSR, finally abandoned them to Hitler in 1939, and cut a deal. We've already talked all about that. Is it fair to say Britain and France were irrational, though? There is definitely a legitimate argument to be made that Britain and France did not forge defense treaties with Stalin because they were scared of communism. Louise Gray Shaw's book The British Political Elite and the Soviet Union makes this argument, but she also points out that Britain thought the Soviet alliance proposals were deliberately provocative to the Germans and raised the risk of war. She quotes the British statesman Halifax as saying, "The more closely we associate ourselves with Russia, the more we produced on German minds the impression that we were plotting to encircle Germany, and the more difficult it would be to make any real settlement." Teddy Aldrichs also makes the argument that Britain was driven by fear of communism in his chapter of the book The Origins of the Second World War Reconsidered, which is a response to A.J.P. Taylor's book of the same name. Shaw, Aldrichs, and Taylor all agree, however, that Chamberlain also feared an alliance with Russia would provoke Hitler, thus making war more rather than less likely. Was this a legitimate fear? Well, there's no way to know for sure, because they didn't make an alliance with the Soviet Union, but here is a very relevant document. On May 23, 1939, months before his invasion of Poland, Hitler assembled a conference of the highest officers of the German military to review Germany's situation. After declaring that the issue was not the German-speaking city of Danzig actually, but making living space for Germans by seizing land to the east, Hitler said, "An alliance of France, England, Russia against Germany, Italy, Japan would lead me to attack England and France with a few devastating blows." That's on May 23, 1939. Hitler made a similar statement in April of that year to Hungary, per a memorandum by the Foreign Ministry. If England really meant to encircle us, then the Führer would strike first. Judging from this, I don't think some sort of grand alliance between Britain, France, and the Soviet Union was going to inevitably and undoubtedly deter Adolf Hitler. It might have just made war more likely. That seems to be the case in 1939, but you know what, earlier in the 1930s it might have worked better to scare off Germany. On the other hand, maybe Germany would have just fought the war anyways. This is Hitler we're talking about, remember? Really, to me, it seemed nothing short of a bullet could stop Hitler. Nobody, not even the USSR, was willing to take the first shot before 1939. But this is a video about Hakim, so let's let him talk some more.
Instead, the West decided that appeasing the Nazis would be a better strategy, and we all know how that turned out. As a result of this reluctance on the part of the West, the USSR was forced to fend for its security alone.
Hate to pause Hakim again so soon, but why exactly did Britain and France not get their act together and confront Germany each time it violated the Treaty of Versailles? With hindsight, it is completely obvious they should have. Their inaction emboldened Germany. It was a complete and utter failure, but why did it happen? Appeasement had plenty of motivations that seemed rational at the time. The policymakers in Britain honestly believed it was the best course to avoid another tragic world war with Germany. Britain just was not ready to fight before 1940. In order to build up its army to confront Germany in the 1930s, it would need to spend dozens of millions of pounds, something Chamberlain called impossible to carry out in that political climate. In 1937, the Chiefs of Staff warned, "We cannot foresee the time when our defense forces will be strong enough to safeguard our trade, territory, and vital interests against Germany, Italy, and Japan at the same time. It could not exaggerate the importance from the point of view of imperial defense of any political or international action which could be taken to reduce the number of our potential enemies." This was the reasoning behind Chamberlain's policy of appeasement. They just were not ready to fight a war. When Britain did declare war on Germany after it invaded Poland in 1939, Britain was kept afloat by massive assistance from, and eventually an alliance with, the United States. Now, of course, there were a few critics of appeasement in the 1930s. Winston Churchill was one of them. Obviously, those critics were proven absolutely correct. Appeasement just did not work. It was a massive disaster, and you can make a pretty good argument that the whole appeasement industrial complex is to blame for opening the space for Hitler's domination of Central Europe. But, at the time, there were rational and sensible arguments for it. You can disagree with that. That's fine. But my point is, we have to at least hold the Soviet Union to the same standard. After all, as soon as Britain dropped appeasement, the Soviet Union picked it up and ran further with it than Britain ever did. We already talked about that in detail, but it's worth considering what both countries did in response to Germany. Let's get back to Hakim, though. I'm going to fast forward through his ad read for male hair loss medication and get right into the meaty part.
We'll start by recalling that the USSR actively pursued overt military alliances with Britain and France in a policy known as collective security. One such offer, made just 2 days before the war began, had the USSR sending 1 million troops, artillery, and airborne forces to help stop Hitler if they agreed to the pact. Such a pact would have drastically altered the course of history. Unfortunately, both Britain and France declined the offer, forcing the USSR to operate unilaterally without Allied support.
Is this true? Did Stalin really offer to send 1 million troops against Hitler 2 days before the war began? Okay, first, this is a nitpick, but according to his own source, an article in The Telegraph, this offer was made on August 15th, 1939. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, so 2 weeks, not 2 days. Obviously, the Soviet Union didn't make this offer in late August since it had already made a deal with Germany by then. You might have heard of it, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. We've been talking about it for 2 hours. But anyways, is this true? Yes, I buy it. The historians the article quotes are a bit skeptical, but from my point of view it makes perfect sense. Here, I'll explain how Britain and France made the largest fumble in human history. The middle months of 1939 were the most decisive in years. In March 1939, Germany invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia from the German-speaking border regions it won in 1938's Munich Agreement. Very shocking, very unpredictable, I know. This strengthened calls for an alliance between Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, but despite negotiations, the Western powers kept dragging their heels. That might sound a bit familiar to you. And on May 3rd, Stalin fired Maxim Litvinov. Now, Molotov did continue negotiations for a tripartite alliance, but the Westerners continued to drag their heels. His proposals seemed pretty reasonable to me: military cooperation and guarantees for the integrity of Eastern European states. So why did Britain turn him down? And we're talking so much about Britain because France was kind of in a position where they kind of had to follow Britain around. So why did Britain turn him down? From Chamberlain's point of view, this deal was just not practical, and agreeing to an alliance on Soviet terms would humiliate Britain and show weakness to Germany. Plus, Britain was worried that making an agreement with Stalin would greenlight Soviet expansion into, say, Poland, Lithuania, Finland, and Romania. Another key point of contention was how exactly the Soviet Union would help them. If you remember, there were several hundred kilometers of Polish people between the Soviets and Germany, and neither Britain nor France had the leverage or will to force Poland to let Russian troops into their country. Poland, understandably, was worried about being attacked from both sides, and they ended up making the biggest mistake in possibly human history. Despite this, Britain and France sent military attachés over to the Soviet Union in August, but Britain was not enthusiastic. Chamberlain wanted to buy time, slowing down the negotiations to prevent the Soviet Union from ditching the West and making a deal with Germany. He thought that as long as they were talking to the Soviets wouldn't betray them and join Germany. Admiral Drax, the head of the British mission, was given no actual power to reach an agreement and traveled by a slow boat rather than just a plane. Again, Chamberlain thought this would delay war by prolonging negotiations. But of course, it ended up just insulting the Soviets, who were secretly entertaining other offers already from Germany. So even though Western military capabilities were dwarfed by the Soviet Union, and even though these newly discovered documents in the Telegraph showed that the Soviets were probably flexing their military strength to these Western attachés, nothing got done. Well, actually the Germans got a deal, actually. Obviously a gigantic missed opportunity on the part of Chamberlain. He had his reasons, and you can definitely make arguments in favor of these reasons, but they were, to put it very charitably, very stupid. With Britain and France clearly duds, the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Germany on August 23rd. Then, a week later, Germany invaded Poland with the Soviet Union neutral. And the rest is history. So what are we left with after all of this? I don't know about you, but that whole last section I felt a growing sense of dread, maybe just because I've been yapping for like 2 hours at this point, but it probably had something to do with how Britain and France completely failed to confront evil when they had a chance to. By the time they were ready to make a deal with the Soviets were gone, ships passing in the night. But of course, if you look at Britain's policies of appeasement, they were echoed by the Soviets basically exactly. But the Soviet Union's appeasement policies were also an order of magnitude dumber than Britain's, with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact laying the foundation for friendship and cooperation between the two dictators. The Soviet Union literally provided food and oil to Germany so it could keep fighting Britain. Stalin was not a genius preparing for war, he underprepared his army. That's why Germany got all the way to Leningrad and Stalingrad. The fact that Stalin butchered his own commanders and huge scores of people he conquered through war, practically shoving them into Germany's arms, weakened the Soviets for their great patriotic war. But let's talk about Hakim for a second. I don't think he's a dumb guy. I'm kind of holding him to a higher standard than I've held other people to because I don't think he's a dumb guy. Clearly he did some research. But again, this is a political video, making a political argument, defending his favorite political ideology. Over the course of this video, you've seen how that sort of bias can twist history, driving Hakim to downplay and deny atrocities, which end up, of course, only hurting his political argument because he looks pretty bad. But you know what? I will leave you with something I said at the beginning of my video on Zoomer Historian who does similar tactics for Germany. The lesson we can take from this bloodshed is how to avoid such a thing again. You can only learn from history if you admit it happened and understand how it happened.
I'm at my family's house for Thanksgiving away from my usual microphone, so apologies for the strange audio change, but anyways, if you like this video, why not support me on patreon.com/whatwhyhow for just $1 a month. You can get previews of future videos. Thanks to those who already do. User SEQ, Marklin, Sheba, Caliber, Lehan Whale, Goblin, Lily, 7-Zip, Lars, Vantachromia, Jared, Omega, Quincy, Dionisio, Chang, Benjamin, Basit, Mimo, Samab, Dreher, Channel 101, Freddy, Party, South Africa, Help Africa, Aaron, Gentle, Trudeau, Kenshi, Sammy, Nephron, Abac, Jude, Jackson, Joao, Sawyer, Landon, Something Original, Nikita, Mountain, Alessandro, and Jeffrey. Thanks, and adios.